Warning: some viewers may find the content of this material disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hello everyone, I'm Simon Haines. Welcome back to the Ramsay Distinguished Lecture Series for 2024. I'm actually speaking to you from the UK this morning, and our guest today is in Canberra, hence the podcasty online mode. But we are in fact continuing a theme for the year that we began with a couple of earlier live events. So this is the third really in a series of talks on the international strategic situation confronting Australia, our region, and indeed the world, as we in the West find ourselves in perhaps the most troubling and challenging epoch since the 1960s. Now, you'll remember we heard in February from a most impressive panel of speakers who were talking about our strategic positioning between China and the United States, vis-à-vis our region and our regional neighbours. And then just a few weeks after that, we heard from Professor Michael Wesley, the Deputy VC at the University of Melbourne, speaking about, or his topic was Living with Leviathans, Australia in a Multipolar Age. Leviathans, multipolar. This theme continues today, although we're shifting the focus away from our immediate region now to a conflict with enormous geostrategic implications, indeed dealing with a Leviathan, and in this case, not China, but Russia and its leader, Vladimir Putin. And also in the context of the terrible events unfolding as we speak in the Ukraine, as they have been doing for 2.5 years and arguably much longer. The most recent atrocity, I'm afraid, still all too fresh in our minds. Our guest today is someone uniquely qualified to help us make some sense of all of this, of what is going on in Ukraine, in Russia, perhaps in the mind of President Putin, and of what might happen in the coming months and years. He is Mr. Kyle Wilson. Kyle graduated in Slavonic languages from the ANU in 1976, before going on to study at the Moscow State and Petersburg universities in the late 70s. He lectured in Russian at the University of Queensland before joining the Department of Foreign Affairs, as it then was, and being posted to Warsaw and Moscow in the 1980s and 90s. In 94 to 95, Kyle also studied Mandarin in Beijing before working in the Australian Embassy there. He worked for 10 years in the Office of National Assessments, again, as it then was, where he was the senior analyst for Russia and Central Asia, a position that involved regular visits to China, to Russia, and to Central Asia. He has served as Russian interpreter for Australian prime ministers, governors general, and ministers over the years. Since retiring from the Australian Public Service, Kyle Wilson has completed an oral history for the Office of National Assessments, and he has been a visiting fellow at the ANU's Centre for European Studies. He publishes analyses for Inside Story and the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. He teaches courses in Russian language and history and contemporary affairs for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade's National Diplomatic Academy, and he lectures at the ANU's National Defence College. Kyle Wilson is a recipient of the Solidarity Medal from the Government of Poland and an Australia Day Medal for his work at the Australian Embassy in Moscow. And his topic for today is Getting Russia Right. So Kyle, maybe we can start at the most kind of high altitude, longue durée level, as Brodel would call it. Famously, it's been said that history is an unreliable guide to the future, but on the other hand, we have no other. So what to you are the major legacies of Russian history, cultural, military, political, that can help us to better understand Russia under Putin?
Thank you, Simon. I'm going to abuse my privilege as the speaker by interpolating something, just taking up your remark about Leviathan. And that is that if the Ramsay audience or our audience wants to consider just one recent document that I think speaks graphically and eloquently about the nature of Russia today, then that is a Russian film called Leviathan. It was made about 10 years ago. It won a major prize at the Cannes Film Festival for its director with an unpronounceable name. I'll give it to you, Mr. Zvyagintsev. But if the audience could just remember, a film called Leviathan, because it is so eloquent about the nature of Putin's Russia, politics in that country, that if you watch that film closely, you'll get very important insights, I think, into that particular country. Okay, so history. Let me start by imagining that a member of our audience, that is an educated follower of Ramsay, finds themselves with a tertiary educated Russian, and says to that Russian, look, I'm very interested in your country. What makes your country different? Why is it, for instance, that a reputable public opinion survey in your country, in Russia, in which respondents were asked, it was a reliable public opinion survey, to rank the 20 greatest figures in history. And 61% came in nominating Stalin as the greatest figure ever in world history. Why is it that another public opinion survey in your country, which asked respondents to name the 10 greatest books ever written in history, its first 5 nominations in those 10 were all Russian books? Intriguingly, George Orwell's 1984 came in at number 6. So, I mean, these are important questions about the nature of Russia today. And if the Russian to whom the Ramsay supporter was speaking took this question seriously, he or she could very well answer with what is the greatest and most unhelpful cliche ever spoken about Russia by the Russian poet Tyutchev. And what he said in translation was, and I will read, the translation is very short: who could grasp Russia with the mind? For her no yardstick was created. Her soul is of a special kind, by faith alone appreciated. That is, in Russia one can only have faith. Now, if the Russian interlocutor were also worldly and had a sense of humor, he or she might quote a 20th century satirical piece of doggerel on that very famous Russian poem, which was written by the satirical Russian poet Igor Guberman in 1997. And he paraphrased the famous poem by Tyutchev in the following way: for fuck's sake, it is high time that we grasp Russia with our minds. You see, the original Tyutchev poem is essentially saying that Russia is so unique that you give up. And especially one of the most frequent phrases that any foreigner hears who goes to Russia and who asks questions is, "Вам не понять." You are a foreigner and you cannot possibly understand Russia because we ourselves can't understand it, because it is beyond understanding. That said, let us turn our minds to why Russia is the way it is today. And what I would say, somewhat provocatively to your audience, is that if you want to understand contemporary Russia, you start with Genghis Khan in the 13th century. Because for 230 years, from about 1220 through to about 1460, that's 230 years, what is today Russia was a part of the Mongol Empire. I mean, that's as long as what we might say is white settlement in Australia, or if you like, depending on your political viewpoint, since the white invasion of Australia, 230 years. And the political culture that has evolved in Russia since that time is a mirror of what Genghis Khan created. What are its characteristics? First of all, it is a militarized empire. Second, all power resides in the hands of one man. It's usually a man. There have been a few women in Russian history. All power, that is, the supreme autocrat. 3, that autocrat is above the law. The law has no bearing whatsoever on that autocrat. 4, people exist to serve the state and not the other way around. So if you look at Russia today, I'm sure your audience would agree, it is an autocracy. We know now that Putin is a supreme ruler, like Genghis Khan, and all matters of importance are decided by him. Another very important aspect of this is that autocracies have one great advantage and one great disadvantage. The advantage is that, unlike in democracies, there's essentially no transactional politics. All the politics in Russia take place in Putin's head. Or if you like, politics comes down to the question of who has access to him, who can influence him. We know that he takes all key decisions, and key decisions are those which he defines as key. This is very important. This is a huge advantage. He can move very quickly to take a decisive action, which he did on the 22nd of February 2 years ago. The disadvantage is that, well, there's two really. Autocracies cannot really evolve other than in one direction. They can only tighten on themselves like a Gordian knot. They can only become more repressive because history teaches, and especially Russian history teaches, that as soon as you try to reform, that is to ameliorate, to soften an autocracy, you are in danger. And that is certainly the lesson that Mr. Putin has drawn from the experience of Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. And the other great disadvantage is, of course, the question of succession. Because as soon as an autocrat names a successor, be that autocrat Xi Jinping or Mao Zedong or Vladimir Putin, immediately power starts to ebb from the autocrat to the successor. So Putin, if you like to quote Shakespeare, is bound upon a wheel of fire. He must die in office. He cannot leave. But I would put it to you, to our audience, that those key features of Genghis Khan's empire are what you see in Russia today, with one important addition. And that addition is the secret police. Now, Genghis Khan, the first ruler we know of to establish a secret police. It was called the Kashik. It was 1,000 chosen bodyguards, a kind of Praetorian Guard. Every single member of that Praetorian Guard had more authority than any general in Genghis Khan's army. They wore black, by the way, and they wore black horses. And to this day, the uniform of the KGB is black. The uniform of the Gestapo was black. And it was Ivan the Terrible, Ivan IV, who first set up an equivalent in Russia called the Oprichnina. And to this day, a single autocrat, with very rare exceptions, rules Russia with the help of a secret police, a Praetorian Guard. Final point I want to make about Russian history. Various good historians have pointed out, whereas other countries go through a kind of evolution which one could describe as an ABC pattern, or if you like, thesis, antithesis begets synthesis. But in Russia, the pattern for 600 years has been A, B, A, B. That is, autocracy leads to an attempt to restore it, which reverts to autocracy. And the contemporary Russian very well respected commentator on Russian affairs, Dmitry Tenin, has put it very succinctly. Every attempt in Russian history to reform the autocracy by making the autocrat, well, by limiting the autocrat's power or by making the autocrat accountable to his or her people, ends up with power in the hands of one man. And that is precisely what has happened in Putin's Russia. So I would put it to you that if we look for the origins of the nature of Russia today, why it remains an autocracy after 600 years, we look back to Genghis Khan and his legacy.
Kyle, fascinating. Thank you very much. Can I just ask a couple of follow-up questions on what you said? One is, can you talk a little bit about the kind of about Russian exceptionalism? I mean, the national sense of itself with an overlay nowadays almost of grievance. So there's the manifest destiny sense of the Russian history. This is the bulwark of civilization, the repository of superior values, but also a kind of resentment post-World War II, which Russia won for the world at huge cost to itself. The cult of 45, if you like, at the core of almost a neo-nationalist civic religion. So can you talk about that a bit? And a second question, if you don't mind dealing with two, is really to do with, and you reference this, the kind of swing backwards and forwards between A and B, between autocracy and an uprising of feeling against the autocrat that he should be more accountable. Why historically is it? Is it true that the Russian people have historically seemed rather acquiescent in the face of despotism and even mass suffering? Is this just how they expect authorities to behave? And is there something happening here where a long history of resigned acceptance of despotism suddenly bursts out into violent revolutionism? You know, I was thinking, actually, Kyle, of something in this week's New York Review of Books by Yuri Shleshkin. The more hopeless the clamour for reform, the more intense the millenarian expectations and the more eternal the questions. So two separate questions, one about Russian exceptionalism and kind of resentment post-45, and the other one about acquiescence or otherwise in Russian people.
Yes, excellent question, Simon. Right. Just one addition to what I said before, because I left out a very important element before I get to exceptionalism, and that is even the most casual look at Russian history by a member of our audience, apart from showing that pendulum swing that we have spoken of, between the oscillation between autocracy and attempts to reform the autocracy, to make it accountable, resulting in a reversion to autocracy. Apart from that, if you look at Russian history, from the time that something that we can reasonably identify as Russia appeared on the map, and that is towards the end of the 15th century, around the 1480, 1490, when the princedom of Muscovy began to acquire power. That is an area about a third the size of Finland, a little bigger than Tasmania. And from that point on, Russian history has been an inexorable, steady expansion outward to what Russia is today, 1/6 of the globe's land surface. What is it? 17 million square kilometers, starting out as 300,000 square kilometers. That movement outwards, the engulfing, the historian Stephen Kotkin has tried to calculate this expansion from about the end of the 14th century, end of the 15th century, and he's calculated that Russia advanced by about 150 square kilometers per day over those 600 years. In Gulf, it went 183 or 184 separate ethnicities. And this is, I think, very important. And if you look at a map of Russia over the history and look at what it looked like, the princedom of Muscovy in, say, 1480, and what Russia looks like today, you see that expansion outward, which, by the way, continues. As you see, Russia is trying to take Ukraine. Russian parliamentary members have called for the Arctic Ocean to be renamed the Russian Ocean, because Russia makes claim to half of the Arctic Ocean, including the North Pole. So that, I think, was important. Russian exceptionalism. This really is very important. The former Financial Times correspondent in Moscow, and of course they're all very good, the FT correspondents, a man called Charles Clover, summed up the message that Russians get 24/7, 7 days a week, every day of the year, since about 2010 on their televisions. 80% of Russians get their news from television. They watch 4 hours a day on average. All television is controlled by the state. And the theme that comes through on that television every day is, all peoples are unique, but we are more unique. We are different. We are ethnically superior. We are owed gratitude for having saved humanity on 3 occasions, from Genghis Khan, Napoleon, and Hitler. We are denied that gratitude. We deserve a special status. We have legitimate security concerns, and we have a right to influence the foreign policy of all our small neighbors to the West, because on 3 or 4 occasions we have been invaded from the West. And we are an object of hatred. The West is mounting a war against us, and we are only defending ourselves. That is what comes through time and time and time again. So Russian exceptionalism, if you were to ask a Russian, what are the words that come to his or her mind first if you mention the word Russia? They will say, great power. Russia is a great power. That's been my experience. That's what they'll say, great power. Now, this is really very interesting, because the Russian word for great power is quite unique. The word is держава. Russia is a держава. Now, the etymology of the word is fascinating. It comes from the verb to grab and hold, and to seize and hold. The other meaning of the word держава is orb, for the monarchists amongst us. The orb, the symbol of a monarch's power. So a держава is a great power which takes other people's lands and holds onto it. So, I mean, that is the literal meaning of держава. Now, that's important in terms of Russian exceptionalism. Now, finally, on Russian exceptionalism, I want to quote to you what a remarkable American diplomat, much celebrated as a Russia hand, George Kennan Jr., wrote in the late 1940s. And he wrote the following: there is a suspicion latent in every Russian soul that the term Russia does not really signify a national society destined to know power and majesty, but only a vast, unconquerable expanse of misery, poverty, inefficiency, and mud. Now, taking our conversation further with our Russian interlocutor, it's quite possible that once the Russian interlocutor has mentioned the word держава, we are a great power, a unique great power, he or she, if they're feeling candid, may go on to say, but why is it that such a great power that has thrice saved humanity from evil, that has produced the world's greatest writers, which has produced some of the world's greatest scientists, how can it be that this power is such a bardak? Now, bardak is an old Mongol or Tatar word which means a brothel in the figurative sense. Why is it that in this country, in Russia, the toilets are so embarrassingly dirty? And the Russian writer Bulgakov offered an answer. And his answer was, the problem is not the lousy, dirty, soiled toilets. The problem is what's in the head of Russians. But anyway, the point is this, that the Russians, like other great powers, you might say, like the British in their heyday, like the Americans, like the Chinese. I mean, anyone who's worked in China has encountered Chinese exceptionalism. So the Russians have that sense of exceptionalism, and in dealing with them, if you're going to deal effectively with them, it is really very, very important to acknowledge it. And time and again, and you mentioned this, time and again, it comes back to the war. Please mention the war, World War II, because in any conversation about Russia's shortcomings or Russia's failing, they will come back to the fact, yes, but we defeated the Nazis. I have friends who have married Russians, and the marriages have failed in 2 cases because of Russian exceptionalism. And it's come down to this notion of what the Germans call Blut und Boden, land and blood. Once Russian blood has been spilled on any land, it automatically becomes sacred and it becomes Russian. And this, of course, leads to the Russian bon mot, which says, the only secure border for Russia is one with Russian soldiers on both sides of it. Now, I may not have answered your question, but I hope that that is of some interest.
No, it certainly is, Kyle. In fact, listening to your...
Asked about revolution. One quick word on revolution. Right. If you were to ask Mr. Putin and his inner circle, his advisors, all former KGB officers, what is the most important word in governing the huge, sprawling empire that is Russia, they would say control. Control. Control.
Yeah.
That is what's important in Russia. If you are going to govern such a massive empire, such a disparate empire, there's only one way to do it. Through an autocracy. An autocracy means control. It means controlling what people do. It means controlling where they go. It means controlling what they think. It means controlling what they write and what they see. And it's one of the great ironies of history that under Mr. Putin we have watched as his particular variant of Russian autocracy has become more and more oppressive. And there's a special word in Russian which means this sudden outburst of violence against those who are in power. The word is bunt. Bunt. There's a direct translation of it in Chinese. It means the people have had enough and they suddenly rise up and they take their axes and they take their nooses and they massacre. And that's what you've got to be afraid of in Russia.
So brilliant, Kyle. Thank you. And in a way, you've given us the perfect segue into my next question, which goes back to what you were saying earlier on about autocracy. And I think you used the phrase of Putin, that all politics are in his head. Now, I know you've argued on other occasions that Vladimir Putin is both the inheritor and the repository, in a sense, of Russia's autocratic tradition. And we know he sees himself very much as the latest in the pantheon, going back to Peter the Great, or as you said, possibly Genghis Khan, but certainly to Stalin. Now, you're one of the very few Australians who's actually had direct dealings with President Putin. So tell us, from that perspective, your views on the most important factors driving his decisions and his actions. How does he see this all playing out? Is there any end game to this awful conflict in his mind? What does he see as his options? I mean, one can't help but think that there's a kind of balance here between his isolated condition, surrounded by presumably a sycophantic coterie, and on the other hand, his head full of this kind of messianism that you've referenced, but also the hard-headed realpolitik perspective of a seasoned KGB officer. I mean, how does that all play out? How does it work in terms of what the Siloviki, his coterie, his surrounding advisors are thinking? Can you give us a set of thoughts about Putin and where he sits and where his mind sits in all of this story?
I think obviously we have to be careful not to over-personalize Russian politics on the one hand, but on the other hand, when you have such, as it were, a complete autocracy, what has now become a distilled autocracy, after 25 years. I mean, he's had power in his hands essentially since 1999. He consolidated that power by about 2002, 2003. So for 20 years, he has been supreme leader. So clearly, his psychology, his personality, what drives him is absolutely crucial, absolutely fundamental. That's number one. Number two, well, let me start with an anecdote. I first encountered him in mid-November 1991. It's a long time ago, showing how old I am. But in November 1991, the then Australian Foreign Minister, Senator Gareth Evans, who was very worried about what the breakup of the Soviet Union would mean, particularly in terms of the possible proliferation of nuclear powers, that he betook himself to the then failing Soviet Union, and he went across it from Vladivostok all the way to Petersburg, and he was in Petersburg very eager to meet the then number two man in Russia after Yeltsin, who was a man called Savchuk, who was the mayor of Petersburg. Now, he was a lawyer, just like Gareth. And so Gareth was very eager to meet him and quite excited at the prospect of doing so, and was very angry indeed when who should turn up to the meeting in St. Petersburg, not Mr. Savchuk, but one of his deputies, a small man with fair hair and, forgive the cliche, cold blue eyes, who said to Minister Evans, my name is Putin. I'm a deputy to Mayor Savchuk. He is very embarrassed indeed that he cannot attend the meeting. He has been called urgently to Moscow by President Yeltsin, and I am here to represent him. So Gareth was cross from the beginning, and the conversation didn't go very well. Gareth's first question I won't go into, but his second question was, so, Mr. Putin, are you a member of the Communist Party? Well, I felt like kicking Senator Evans. I was his interpreter under the table, because this was a very provocative question, given that the Communist Party had just fallen from power and was being blamed at that stage for the disintegration of the Soviet Union, etc. So Putin, very cool, looked at Gareth across the table and said, Minister, I am a military man. In our system, in the military, in the Russian Soviet military, once you reach a certain rank, you are offered membership of the party. It is not a career-enhancing choice to decline that offer. If I had had my choice, I'm not quite sure what I would have done. But as a military man, yes, I am also a party man. Now, it was very interesting that Putin should have said, I'm a military man, because the Russian word for military can be also translated as, I am a man of war. And that is indeed proved to be the case. Putin is a man of war. Gareth followed up this answer from Putin with the following question. I see, Mr. Putin, so you're a military man. And what branch of the military have you served in, may I ask? And Putin coolly said, I am not at liberty to say, which was clearly code for I'm in intelligence. So, as you said, Mr. Putin was a career KGB officer, number one. That's very important. In that regard, I want to inflict on on our audience what I think is a very remarkable quote about Putin, offered by a former opponent of his, a former deputy head of MI6, who said this about Putin. He contrived to get into the organization he worshipped, the KGB, but he never reached its glamorous elite. He was not a member of the first Chief Directorate, Foreign Intelligence, and his sole posting was to East Germany, which did not really count as a foreign posting. Within the KGB, his role and prestige was comparable to that of a special branch officer in a country constabulary relative to an officer of MI6. So it is small wonder that this unusually short man, from a humble professional background, in an institution prominent in a failed regime who is abruptly elevated to head the country and indeed head the successor regime itself should exhibit the signs of bitter resentments, hypersensitivity to any perceived slight. Moving right along. In June 2016, I happened to be standing next to a Russian who knew Putin very well. He was the editor-in-chief of what was then a fairly independent radio station called Radio Moscow, and he used to see Putin once a month because Putin, rather like Rupert Murdoch, used to call in the editors and give them guidance. In very careful terms, he would give them a briefing on what was happening. So I was standing next to this particular man whose name was Venediktov. When he was asked by someone in our small group, and knowing that he could be recorded because we were in a room in the Australian ambassador's residence, he was asked, what drives Putin? And his answer was this: Putin is a KGB officer from the Brezhnev era who has never come to terms with Russia's loss in the Cold War and the humiliation of the Russian military in Afghanistan. And he is thirsting for retribution. Now, that was 2016. So what comes to my mind, we can be absolutely sure that Vladimir Putin knows the phrase, vengeance is mine, and I shall repay. Because it is the inscription, it is the epigraph on the opening of Anna Karenina, which he has surely read. Vengeance is mine, and I will repay. And this particular man said that Putin is driven by a Russian word, abida. Abida means a deep personal sense of offense. So I think that's really a key to understanding Putin. And if you like, what comes to mind is the Latin phrase which is attributed to Caligula, oderint dum metuant, let them loathe me so long as they fear me. Now, another favorite phrase of Putin's, which he quotes repeatedly, comes from Stalin, the weak get beaten. More quotes from Putin, he who dares wins. And a final quote, if you have to strike, strike first and strike hard. Now, finally, Genghis Khan was once asked his entourage what was the definition of happiness. And they talked about hunting and fine horses and fine women, and he said, you're all wrong. The definition of happiness is savoring and relishing the humiliation of your defeated enemies. I have absolutely no doubt that Putin is aware of that phrase too. And he would also know Thucydides, very famous, the strong do as they wish, and the weak suffer what they must. And Putin actually once said, he said this about Ukraine. Quoting a Russian pop song, he used a sentence which deals with rape. And the sentence is, whether you like it or not, my dear, you must endure it. And he used that phrase about Ukraine. So this is Mr. Putin. Of course, he's very clever. He has a very good memory. He has learned respectable English, of course, fluent in German. He's very careful about his own health. All his food comes from Russian Orthodox Church monastery gardens. He never abuses alcohol, ever, ever. He will take a sip of wine all night at an official banquet. So he is a man, but he also knows, I'm sure he knows, he cannot hand over power unless he can work a miracle. Find a protector, someone who can guarantee his safety, the safety of his second wife and their 2 children. No one is actually meant to know about that, but it is said that he has 2 children with his second wife. Someone who can guarantee the safety of his daughters, that is, who can guarantee his and his family's safety. Now, that's what he had with Yeltsin. That was the deal with Yeltsin. I will make you president. And in return, you will not touch me and not touch my family. And that was President Putin's first decree. And so he's stuck there. Now, that said, the Financial Times recently had a very good article, most of their articles on Russia are excellent, by Max Seddon about Putin thinking about the future, and he has been appointing the children of his close allies to important, very important positions in Russia. It's rather like Republican Rome. The senators and the emperors, as it were, make an investment in their future and their safety by appointing the children of the senior senators. And I think that is what is happening with Putin now. The final point is, of course, we get onto Ukraine now because he has undertaken this war. It is his war. We know that. We know why he undertook it. He said so. It's got nothing to do with Russia's security. It's got everything to do with the fact that he is utterly convinced that Ukraine is ours. That's why he undertook the war. And Russian officials have actually said this. One of them said, important point, if you'll bear with me, Simon, because we're now on to Ukraine. In October 2016 at Chatham House, a senior Russian observer, roughly the equivalent of, say, Michael Wesley in Australia, said under Chatham House rules, and therefore I can't name him, Putin is not so stupid as to think that he can reconstitute the Soviet Union as it was. But there is a core of Russian lands which are rightfully ours. Belarusia, northern Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. And Moldova. And he then said, he finished up by saying, and it would be nice to have them back. So that is what we are seeing now.
Yes. Kyle, thank you. And we're now circling into Ukraine, which we must do. But briefly, just a couple of follow-ups, not so much on Putin, but on the war more generally, and some of contemporary commentary on the war from the West. Commentators in the West often say that the Russians do have legitimate security concerns which must be accommodated. Some would claim, including recently in the UK, Nigel Farage, some would claim that NATO mishandled Russia and has done so ever since 1989, has foregone a chance to bring Russia into the Western fold, but instead has stupidly played into its paranoias and essentially driven the country into the arms of China. So what would you say to that? And the second part of the question to do with, in a sense, the prosecution of the war going forward. Mark Galeotti argued in yesterday's Times that if the war is about who can sacrifice the most, then Putin will win it. 40% of Russia's national budget is being spent on defense, but that's still much less than in the 1970s. And he doesn't care how many young Russian lives he sacrifices. He can't be held to account as long as he wins. So where are we going with the war? And in terms of the Western response, is there much to take comfort from in the recent NATO declarations? Is that really a statement of resolve of any kind from NATO? On sanctions, are they working? And if not, why not? I mean, real wages are rising in Russia. How long can that continue? Will ordinary Russians stand for big tax increases? Have the elite wealth networks actually been damaged at all? Has Russia, in effect, bet the house on China? Could the US do anything about that if it wished to? That's more about China, I suppose, really. But so generally, on the economic stuff and on the prosecution of the war, what's the outlook? What's your judgment about where we're going? About how Putin thinks about it?
Okay, let's start with NATO and this argument that in fact Russia's actions are purely defensive. It has been forced onto the defensive by the expansion of NATO. I feel a little reticent about quoting a journalist, an Australian journalist called Bernard Keane, who writes for Crikey, because there's not much he writes with which I agree. But Bernard Keane of Crikey in Australia wrote this, and bear with me if I quote, because I think this is eloquent. Putin's invasion is an act of imperialist aggression, one that denies the existence of Ukraine as any sort of independent state. For Putin, it's a rogue province that must be reincorporated into Russia or at least kept under strict economic and military control. The entire argument that Putin is engaged in a transactional project in which his goal is security is in effect demolished by his own word. Ukraine is Russia and must always be so. There's no transactional security guarantee that will change that. That's number one. Number two, we have three authoritative Russian commentators, two of them military commentators, writing in the weighty Russian military journal, Военный Courier, that is the military courier, disputing the assertion that NATO's expansion has anything to do whatsoever with Russia's legitimate security concerns. I could quote them, but time is limited, so I won't. But two senior Russian military figures writing in a military journal and saying the very notion that NATO could threaten Russia, which has more nuclear weapons than any other country, and what's really very important, far more tactical nuclear weapons than any other country. The notion that NATO or NATO country might invade Russia, when Russia over 600 years has been successfully invaded only twice, once by Genghis Khan and once by the Japanese. That is, on both occasions, by Asian powers. Every European attempt to invade Russia has ended in disaster. So the very idea, and it's farcical, it's comical, the notion that somehow rather a NATO country might invade Russia. I go back to the Russian bon mot, quoted quite frequently, that the Russian idea of security is that on its western borders, Russia can be secure only if it can dictate or have tutelage over the foreign policies of those neighbors. That is, they must be either under Russian control or they must be neutral. So it seems to me that Putin himself has made a nonsense of that particular argument. You quoted some important figures. There are 144 million Russians. There were 40 million Ukrainians. In a war of attrition, as you say, those figures suggest, taken together with the military spending. By the way, I would take issue, this is a minor, but I would take issue with Mark Galeotti, for all my respect for him. He's a front rank Russia hand, that the Russians were spending more on the military in the Soviet Union. It's not true. They were spending about 25%. That is, in other words, 1 in every 4 rubles of revenue went to what was called security. Now, security in Russian is a bit like, great power in Russian. There's a particular Russian word. The Russian word for security translates as the absence of danger, the negation of danger. So security in Russia includes the security services. And let's remember that the KGB and its successor is a militarized organization. They wear uniform. Putin was a colonel. They have the right to bear arms. So now, the Soviet Union, according to Mikhail Gorbachev, whom we can trust, was spending about 1 in every 4 rubles on security. Under Putin, within the last 10 years, it rose to 33%. It's now, as he says, up to 40%. Now, another very important point here is that recent commentators have been saying that Russia is on a war footing. Russia has it, the economists will tell you, those who follow the Russian economy closely, will tell you that Russia has been on a war footing since about 2010. This has a long history. Putin has been thinking about this for a long time. But no, obviously, in a war of attrition against Ukraine, there can only be one winner, and so Putin is settling in for a long haul, his initial plans having been thwarted, and you'll recall that there was an assumption in what the Russians call the West, that is, in the UK, in the EU, in Washington, that the Russians would, in fact, they would prevail. They would take Kiev within 2 days. And so hence the offer to Zelensky, for a ticket out. So, yes, that looks very grim. So what becomes absolutely crucial now, as we know, are two things. What happens when Mr. Trump assumes power? And day by day, it looks more and more likely that not only will we have three great powers that are autocracies, China, India, in effect an autocracy, and Russia, but a fourth autocracy, the United States. What happens to Ukraine then? What will the EU do? What will the UK do? What will France and Germany do? What will the Balts and the Nordics do? Will they be able to fill the vacuum? One simply doesn't know. One thing we can be absolutely sure of, the Ukrainians, A, know that they're fighting for their very existence. B, they do not fancy being under the heel of Vladimir Putin and the vengeance he will take on them, because Putin also once said that there's one thing that he can never forgive: treason or betrayal. As far as he's concerned, the Ukrainians have betrayed him. So they are fighting for their existence and for their lives. So this is going to continue. Putin clearly is willing to keep fighting. Will he have enough troops? Will he have enough? Will he be able to draw? As you probably know, your audience may be aware, he's been very careful so far to protect the children of the elite. Very careful. He's also allowed tens of thousands of young Russians to leave Russia. He hasn't wanted them because they have come from the elite cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg. The highest rate of casualties and serious injuries have been Russia's Siberian peoples, and especially the Buryats. That is, young men who face no economic prospects in the depths of Siberia and can be, as it were, motivated to go and fight in the Russian military. Will an end point be reached? Will a tipping point be reached? Will a point come at which the Russian mothers and the Russian wives and the Russian daughters and Russian young men say, basta, no more. This has gone far enough. We no longer support this. We don't know. The public opinion surveys that we have, and let's face it, reliable public opinion survey in Putin's Russia is a non sequitur. It's an oxymoron. Who is going to say over the phone in Putin's Russia whether or not they support the war in Ukraine, really? But the best public opinion surveys we have suggest that 2 out of every 3 Russians at present support the war. So Putin at the moment is not facing a crisis. What will happen to the Russian economy? This brings us to sanctions. Okay, the questions about sanction is this. You have worked as a civil servant, and you know that the advice that civil servants often give to governments is the least unpalatable option. What were the options to imposing sanction on Russia, on Putin, after he invaded Ukraine in February 2022? There were 2 options: do nothing or go to war. No one wanted to go to war. And the third was sanctions. Now, that's number 1. 2, sanctions take time to work. They take years to work. And what's absolutely crucial in Russia's case is cutting off their access to that Western technology that they need to continue to manufacture their weapons, to supply their army, to build drones, etc. Hence the massive Russian effort that is being directed into intelligence, into espionage, which we have just seen in Australia. We've just seen it, writ large. An attempt to insert a Russian into the Defense Department in the telecommunications comms area and to extract sensitive information. Final point. Russia has been very successful in ameliorating the effects of sanctions by relying on its old friends, China and India. Also, of course, the Greeks, because it's the Ukrainians who have been telling us that it is the Greek shipping magnates in particular who are shipping Russian oil and gas to Turkey, to India, and to China. Which brings us, of course, to China. And here, Simon, I can't resist quoting to you what is the most famous line in the 80-year history of relations between Russia and Australia. We've had 80 years of diplomatic relations with the Russians. And in about 1981, long before many of our audience were born, in 1981, when Russia was still in Afghanistan and the Fraser government was deeply opposed to the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, the then Department of Foreign Affairs invited the number 2 at the Soviet embassy, a man called Yevgeny Rogov, a very professional Soviet diplomat, an irascible man, but an effective diplomat. They invited him to lunch. And at that lunch were people whom you would know. One was a man called John Bowen. Another was a man called Ralph Harries. And over lunch, the Russian diplomat, the Soviet diplomat Rogov, was asked about geopolitics, and he said the following, which was recorded and has gone down in history as the most resounding phrase in those 80 years of bilateral relations. And he said, "One day, Russia will get back into bed with the Chinese, and then we will screw you from both ends." Now, what a prescient statement that was. But of course, what Mr. Rogov, who later became my colleague and friend when I served in Moscow, what he couldn't have foreseen was that when Russia got back into bed with the Chinese, it would be underneath. It would be in the junior position. And this, of course, brings us to Russian views of China. And one of the, as we all know, popular humor, be it in China or be it in Australia or be it in Russia. In Russia, of course, today you've got to be a little careful with popular humor and be careful it's not directed towards the president. But one of the oldest Russian jokes is a play on words, a play on the title of one of the books that is in the top 20 foreign novels read by Russians, and that is All Quiet on the Western Front by Maria Remarque, a book widely read in Russia, All Quiet on the Western Front. And so the Russian joke, the play on words goes, "All quiet on the Sino-Finnish front." Russians love to retail that particular one. And then there's the other, and this popular humor, I think, is a very useful and important window into collective Russian thinking and disquiet about the position in which they find themselves now, increasingly dependent on China. And this is the following very well-known Russian joke. That Mr. Putin it is well known that Mr. Putin sleeps from about 3 in the morning till about 10, when he gets up and goes to his swimming pool. He is awoken at 6 in the morning by his chief of staff, who apologizes profusely, abjectly for waking the president of Russia with all the weight on his shoulders, and says, "Mr. President, I felt it my duty to wake you because we have a top secret cable from our ambassador in Beijing, which contains momentous news, and I felt it was my duty to wake you to." And Putin says, "Okay, understood. What is in secret cable from Beijing?" "Well," says the chief of staff, "there is good news and bad news." And Putin says, "Well, I'd better have the bad news first. What is it?" "According to our ambassador in Beijing, last night the Chinese landed on the moon." "I see," says Putin. "And what is the bad news? What is the good news?" "All of them." All of them. So this is Russian popular humor. And so Russia today finds itself in this unique position because, yes, by all means, Simon, let me see, I'm rabbiting on about Sino-Russian relations. That might do for now.
Thank you, Kyle. It's inevitably, of course, we're almost out of time when there's still so much to say, and we've just scratched the surface, honestly. But it would, I think you'd agree, be fairly inappropriate for us to spend a whole hour on this broad theme and not talk a bit more about Ukraine itself. What is happening in the country, especially the latest atrocity, the bombing of a children's hospital in Kiev just a couple of days ago, as if timed to coincide with the NATO summit. So I read a piece in the FT yesterday by Alexander Mikhed. I don't know whether you've seen this, where the Ukrainian writer, who says Russian culture is an integral part of a repressive imperial machine. And he quotes a Soviet-era painting entitled "He Hit Me with a Hammer and Then Burst into Tears." And he says this is exactly Russia. I'm quoting him, "They make a barbarian atrocity and then they cry, provoking compassion, and then start all over again." So for him, for Mikhed and for many Ukrainians, suffering as they are, Russia is an object of complete hatred, the ultimate imperialist nationalist monster, not a wonderful place of deep mystic soul-making which we need to get in tune with. There is no Russian soul, this writer says, there's just a void. So there's that. But on the other hand, women and children are dying in huge numbers. Not all men are so keen to go to the meat grinder of the front. If a surrender of a certain amount of territory will stop the horror, is it worth paying the price? What is the mood in the Ukraine? Did the recent NATO declaration make any difference? What is the resolve? What is the quality of the resolve in the country as we enter 2.5 years of war?
You and I, as I said, were civil servants, and far too late in my career did I learn that one of the most powerful arrows in the vocabulary, one of the most powerful phrases in the vocabulary of any civil servant in answer to a question from the minister or the prime minister is, "Minister, I don't know. I wish I knew. I will try to find out the answer and get back to you," without actually being in Ukraine, without being there. I find it very difficult to answer the question about the general mood, the degree to which the inevitable hatred, which is, of course, Putin's achievement, might be swinging towards a sense of hopelessness and an inclination, as it were, to end the slaughter, to, peace, not at any price, but at some price. I don't know. What I can say, I think, usefully for our audience is that the Russians have a saying: "На войне, как на войне." In war as in war, which translates as, it's an old Russian saying, and it means, in war, anything goes. If we look back at Russian history, one of the most notorious incidents was what's called the Massacre of Praga. Praga is a large suburb on the eastern bank of the Wisła River, which divides Warsaw. In 1794, towards the end of the uprising against the Russians, the Russian imperialists, led by the man after whom Mount Kosciuszko is named, Tadeusz Kościuszko, the Russian Marshal Suvorov attacked that eastern part of Warsaw, Praga, took it in 4 hours, and proceeded to massacre the 12,000 inhabitants, and ordered that their bodies, men, women, and children, be left on the streets to rot. And as the French would say, pour encourager les autres, as a lesson. Anything goes in war. And it seems that if we look at Putin's policies towards Ukraine, and it's now, I think, beyond reasonable argument that the Russian missile which struck the children's hospital was aimed at precisely that target. And if you look at the finer points of the targeting, it didn't hit the hospital main building. It hit one of the subsidiary buildings. It hit a wing of the hospital. not the main building. This was a very precise attack. And it was, as you say, eloquent. What he is essentially doing is, in figurative terms, he's doing this. If I can show you on the camera, this is a Russian rude gesture. Up yours. Up yours. So you're having NATO summit directed against me? This is my reply. I dare you to do your worst. Now, it's really very noteworthy that that should be his attitude. He's clearly feeling very confident. We don't really need to be highly prescient or wise geopoliticians to know that the Russians are awaiting a Trump victory. They're awaiting the day when, even before he takes up the presidency, Mr. Trump acts on his words and says, I will solve this war within one day. Interesting point I'd like to make here, important linguistic point. You cannot translate into Russian the English proverb, actions speak louder than words. In Russian, words are actions. Everything Putin says is an action. So, Mr. Trump has spoken, Mr. Putin is waiting for November, when, as far as he is, and in the meantime, as we see, he will redouble his efforts to get as much Ukrainian territory as he can, because his assumption will be that Trump will say to the Ukrainians, you will enter peace talks now, I am cutting off all aid otherwise. And we know that the Russian position on those peace talks will be, we keep Crimea, and the border between Russia and Ukraine is defined along the lines that we now hold. So Putin will be trying to take the whole of Donetsk and Lugansk provinces by November. That's what he'll be trying to do. What he will do in Kharkov, very important question. We don't know. Second largest Ukrainian city. And of course, one of the first cities where Putin aimed missiles, not just against hospitals and schools, but against libraries and museums. Libraries and museums. So now what we're watching is two train lines converging. On the one hand, the Ukrainian will to fight, driven by hatred, which has, of course, been generated by Putin. And on the other hand, the US presidential election and the possibility that US aid to Ukraine will cease, and that the other suppliers of aid, which include Australia, the Scandinavians, the Nordics, and the EU, and Great Britain, will not be able, as it were, to make up the deficit. That seems to me is where we are now. So, no, if I'd been Mr. Zelensky coming away from the NATO summit, I would be thinking, Putin is right. It was a meeting. I got something, but I got nowhere near enough. And commentator after commentator has been making the point that NATO and Biden have been pusillanimous. So worried have they been presumably by Russia's and Putin's saber-rattling of nuclear weapons. I mean, the very notion that he would set off a nuclear weapon in Ukraine is, it seems to me, beggars belief. What he might do, we should never underestimate him, that's what we've learned about him, is he might set off a demonstration nuclear device, say, above the Arctic Ocean. Very small yield above the Arctic Ocean, which he claims as Russian territory. It seems to me that is a possibility. If he perceived that the war were beginning to swing against him, it seems to me not inconceivable that he might do that. We shouldn't, as it were, negate the very possibility that he would do that. He could do that.
Goodness. Well, Kyle, unfortunately, time is not on our side. I hope it's more on Zelensky and Ukraine's side than you've been suggesting, but I fear maybe not. What you've had to say to us has been deeply insightful, and I have to say deeply sobering and disquieting as well. But thank you so much, Kyle Wilson, for giving us some of what you've learned from a lifetime's immersion in Russia and the Russians. And one does get a sense of just how immensely complex and, in a sense, intractable this Leviathan actually is. But Kyle, thank you so much. It has been a privilege. Wonderful to hear from you. And meanwhile, can I just say to our Ramsay audience, I hope you found as much in this conversation as I did. I'm sure you did. Do keep watching our website for news of forthcoming events, both live and online, later this year and into next. So with warm thanks to Kyle Wilson, this is Simon Haines saying goodbye for now.